So I can see how people are logging on. We're giving it a minute here. People are still logging on right on time. Welcome, everybody. Still people logging on. Well, I think we are right at 4 o'clock here. And with this, welcome everybody. Welcome to Great Decisions, our speaker series, which is an initiative of the Foreign Policy Association, sponsored locally by the World Affairs Council, St. Louis, and AMSO Global, which is the International Office of the University of Missouri, St. Louis. My name is Liane Constantine. I'm the Executive Director of AMSO Global. And it is my pleasure to share that AMSO Global has been a partner of this important speaker series and a sponsor for many years. It's my pleasure to welcome you all today. And before we start, just a few remarks on the tradition of the speaker series. As I mentioned earlier, Great Decisions is an initiative of the Foreign Policy Association. The first Great Decisions group was launched in Portland, Oregon in the year 1954. And it was based on a face-to-face model facilitating active and informal conversation about the world. And meanwhile, Great Decisions has developed into the largest US-based discussion program about foreign policy, providing an opportunity to US audiences to learn about and to understand the complexity of foreign policy issues of our time, and also to understand the essentials of a democratic society. As many of our frequent followers know, the World Affairs Council is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization with local chapters across the United States. We are a membership-based organization that connects each local chapter with the world. And founded in 1948, its mission is to offer programs which promote understanding, engagement, relationships, and leadership of world affairs. Here in St. Louis, in the St. Louis metropolitan region, and in the state of Missouri, I personally believe we have reason to be proud of our continuous engagement in that international space, and due to our active, creative, and ambitious membership base that we have had alongside our impressive volunteer leaders. So with no further delay, though, I'd like to hand it over to our moderator of today, who is Professor Matt Taylor from AMSO. Please, Matt, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Liana. Appreciate that. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for taking the time to be with us today on this snowy, icy afternoon in St. Louis. Hopefully everybody's warm and safe and doing well. So today is an exciting day. I'm really pleased to be the moderator and thankful for the opportunity to do so. Our speaker today is Dr. Tom Hare. He's a senior researcher at the Pulte Institute for Global Development and the director of the Central America Research Alliance. His research examines rule of law and human rights programs in Central America, and he also produces international development programs, some of which have been funded by the Department of State, the U.S. Agency for International Development, and the United Nations. He also is the author of the book Zonas Peligrosas, The Challenge of Creating Safe Neighborhoods in Central America. This is a book that's a collection of 4 neighborhood studies around San Salvador in El Salvador. And the book also goes on to talk about orderliness and security. It's by Fordham Series in Urban Studies. And at last peekaboo on Amazon, there was one left. So act quickly to get your hands on it. So today, Dr. Hare is going to talk about the state of drug policy in Latin America. And with that, I'll pass it on.
Thanks a lot, Matt. And I'm pretty sure there was only 2 or 3 actually printed, so one left is not bad. But thank you, and thanks to UMSL and the World Affairs Council and the Foreign Policy Association for hosting this session and for asking and always asking good questions about critical decisions such as drug policy. Now, as Matt mentioned, my research over the past few decades is focused on crime and violence prevention in Central America, and especially its impact on governance, human rights, and displacement. So I'm going to use that lens as we talk through the issue of drug policy in Latin America, and really focus on Central America and how the policy has and has not, how the presence of drugs and drug trafficking has impacted the region. Next slide, please. So obviously this is a crowd that doesn't need a geography lesson, but just a refresher on where Central America is, and this will be the most basic thing I talk about, I promise. And we're really focusing on, when we talk about Central America, when I talk about Central America, I'm talking about the countries on the isthmus between Mexico and Colombia. So you can see from Guatemala and Belize on down through Panama. And we'll talk further on about how that geography really impacts, and its position in the world really impacts what happens locally in each of these countries. And so, of course, one can't work in the region and on the region without considering the impact of that geography and the impact of the drug trade. And though the drug trade and the drug policies are not responsible for all of the challenges the region faces, drugs are certainly a major part of the complex system of issues facing Central America today. And we'll unpack that a little bit as we go through. On the larger scale, looking across Latin America, looking at US policy in the region, toward the region, and then specifically the impact that all that has in the region. And as Matt mentioned, the focus of my research is on more than the drug trade itself. I really see the drug trade as a part of an ecosystem that involves issues and has impact on issues of democracy, governance, and human rights. And I do this together in partnership with a group that we've convened at Notre Dame of researchers and experts from 16 different institutions in Central America. So a lot of what I'll be talking about today, I've learned from some of these great experts in the region. Next slide. Now, you can't travel through Latin America if we zoom out to look at Latin America as a whole. You can't travel through the region and through really the Western Hemisphere without seeing signs of the drug trade. And so just anecdotally, I wanted to share a couple of the things that I've witnessed over the years during my time studying in the region in Central America, time studying in Argentina and traveling throughout. And so just a couple of things just to frame really how, if you're looking for it, how much you see or how near you can be to what's happening with the drug trade in Latin America. So starting in the top left, looking, and then we'll move clockwise from there. One of my first experiences was on a bus from Buenos Aires to Rio, which is an experience in itself. And as we were riding along, we saw a number of very square-looking duffel bags being loaded onto the bus just about at the tri-border region between Argentina, Brazil, and Paraguay, which is a very active drug trafficking area, especially for the local market in Rio. And we said to it, my wife and I looked at each other and we said, well, wouldn't it be interesting if that's what we think it is? And sure enough, not another 2 hours later, we stopped along the side of the road and the mystery people got off the bus and took their square duffel bags and just disappeared into the darkness. We thought, well, that seems suspicious. And not 5 minutes later, we were stopped at a traffic stop, a pretty established search point for drugs along that route. So there was obviously something going on there that was a part of something nefarious happening there. We never saw inside the bags, fortunately. And then the next picture in Mexico, and this was actually in Playa del Carmen, one of the nicer parts of the Caribbean there, where we arrived one morning, I think shortly after landing in Playa and heading to our lodging. And we saw this restaurant that it looked pretty, something had happened, and we were able to ascertain from other people and the taxi driver that the restaurant had been bombed the night before in this pretty active tourist area. And the reports that came out afterwards were that they hadn't been paying the appropriate amount in protection from the cartel. And that was their warning. And then the next one in Bolivia, briefly, I think this is one of the things that we lose sight of sometimes when we talk about the impact of the drug trade in the United States. Top right, Bolivia, coca cultivation in Bolivia, traditional. It's been there since, time immemorial. It's been used locally. It has medicinal purposes, and it's used locally for various means. So that's just one thing to witness that on the shores of Lake Titicaca is a good reminder that there's more to this than just what we see in the news and otherwise. Then moving down to the bottom and a little quicker, as an international observer, I was in Colombia to observe the elections with the Organization of American States in 2007 through the local elections. And in the lead up to those elections, numerous candidates in the region were threatened, several were killed, and many, it came to light, were either not aligning themselves appropriately or aligning themselves too much with different factions, with the cartels and others, other interests in Colombia. So you could really see the political influence firsthand. And then middle, very briefly, if you're ever flown into Belize City, and you look off to the side when you're driving out of the airport, anytime I've been there, which is numerous times over the past few years, there's a series of private planes lined up, and you start to think, there's a lot of wealth here. People have private planes. Turns out most of those are drug planes that have been confiscated. They land on the roads in Belize, in some of the more remote areas, and then are shuttled or flown briefly over to the airport to later be auctioned off. So just a reminder that that's always an active part of it. And then the last one is just in Central America generally, looking at, as I mentioned, how the drug trade impacts individuals, institutions, and systems overall through the research that I conduct with the Central America Research Alliance. And so I would say with all this, I have a certain bias in that I know more people impacted by the secondary effects of the drug trade and the war on drugs than I do people who are impacted by drug use here in the United States. And that comes from a certain privileged position and background that I have, but I think it does impact the way I see the issue and treat the issue. Next slide, please. So very briefly, what's kind of our guide for today for the next 40 minutes or so that we have together? And then we really want to leave a lot of time for questions and answers. I think there's a lot of good discussion to be had on the brief that hopefully everyone has read very closely, and what I might talk about here. Hopefully it sparks some debate. But yeah, I want to look over a little bit of the history through the brief, just the highlights very, very quickly. Some of the trends, just to make sure we're on the same page about what numbers are behind all this, what's been happening over the past few decades of the war on drugs, et cetera. I do want to take a little bit of time to then look at the case of Honduras, because I think it's a very good case and very timely case about what happens at a national level in Central America, especially as we look at the drug trade and the impact of the drug trade. And then we'll talk more about some of the decisions. Where do we go from here? We've seen the punitive approach for the past few decades in the war on drugs, the criminalization of drug use and trafficking, obviously. Are there more proportional responses that might work to a larger extent, or even the liberal responses? So there's a whole spectrum of response options there that we can discuss and debate. Next slide. So how did we get here? And this is all laid out very well again in the brief. And I think, these are just some of the highlights, right? That over 100 years, for over 100 years now, the United States and the global community have been looking at how do we deal with drug control? How do we best moderate and in some way limit the impact of these substances that are out there? And that's changed a lot over time, and we'll look at that a little bit too, of which drugs are we talking about, who are we talking about that are using them, et cetera. And I think it's always a good reminder that the first real declaration of war on drugs was in 1969 by Nixon, and then really reiterated and doubled down upon by Reagan in the 80s. And that's just a little bit of a different approach in each of those. One from looking at sort of as they talk about in the brief, the hippie culture that Nixon apparently didn't really favor, and wanting to get rid of that, to some of the more, not to say serious, but the pervasive use and trafficking of cocaine that really skyrocketed during the 80s that Reagan had to face. And then some of the responses, right? So that was here in the United States, that was interdiction, all of that, criminalization. But then also, I think it's important to look at, starting from 1999 onward, all the various plans that the United States has put together, mostly in discussion and dialogue with partners in Colombia and Mexico and Central America. Some is less discussed and more imposed, but starting with Plan Colombia in 1999, then moving as Mexico became a large both production and transit country, or the impact or the realization of its importance came to the fore, of looking at the Merida Initiative, and then subsequently the Central America Regional Security Initiative and the Caribbean Basin Security Initiative. And so you can see here a little bit of this trajectory and this change of, okay, we're moving from here to here, moving from place to place. Colombia, the United States has been engaged for decades with them, not only on interdiction and other things, but also on institution building, which is a big part of Plan Colombia. But you start to see some of the balloon effect that's happening, and we'll see that in some of the maps that we look at. But again, I think that the important thing with these different plans and these engagements is really a move toward an understanding of the importance of institutional strengthening of justice systems, of political systems in various countries, and trying to respond and help in a sustainable way, help these countries really react to what's happening, and hopefully in the best case scenario be able to get ahead of what's happening. With the Central America Regional Security Initiative, for example, I worked with the State Department's Bureau for International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs on transnational crime programs and strengthening institutions, prosecutors' office, specialized prosecutors on transnational crime. But then they also include different related and somewhat not related, and we'll talk about this too, issues of security such as gangs in the region. But I think what it really shows with these plans, and these, we're talking, at least for the Central America Regional Security Initiative, I think for Plan Colombia, it was more multi-billions of dollars invested each year. And it shows the complexity of the bureaucratic response throughout the United States, or throughout the institutions of the United States, from the DEA to the State Department, to the Agency for International Development, the Defense Department through Southcom, et cetera, and the need for coordination and collaborative work on these issues. It also demonstrates, for those that are interested, of the difficulties of getting in our own way at times too. I think this is laid out pretty well in different sort of pop culture ways. And when you look at the legacy of the DEA and the CIA in Colombia, there's a really good book called Killing Pablo that documents this. It's a nonfiction that really goes through some of the evidence of what really happened and how close did we come to getting in our own way in Colombia, and not at least taking care of one nefarious actor there. And they touch on it too, and for those that watch Narcos on Netflix, more fictionalized, but they also get into that space as well. But it's informative to see the challenges and the complexities there. And I think the thing that strikes me too as an observer of public policy is, as in a lot of issues, we're not talking about a rational response. There is no rational actor model here. It is politics. It is politics among our partners. It is international relationships driven by self-interest. It is internal interests within the United States. And so we need to, as much as possible, obviously, as an academic, I like to try to step back and use data to inform our approach. And so that's one thing we'll look at here. All right, next slide, please. Before we get too far, I did want to check some of our assumptions. I think it's always good to see and take a pulse of what is our knowledge base on these issues, and do we know as much as we think we know? And so I think the best way to do this maybe is to just everybody go ahead and answer these for yourselves. If you feel like you really know a lot about one issue or another, feel free to drop it into the chat or the Q&A that, what your answers are to that. But I see we did get the poll to work. Go ahead and let's go ahead with the poll. So go ahead and answer these in the poll here. I'll give you 1 minute to do this, and then we'll just see where we all land on this. All right, 20-second warning. Make your selections. All right, let's close it out and see, can we show the responses? Great. So overall drug use in the United States has been on the decline for the past few decades. It looks like about 20% thought that was probably true, and 80% thought it was false. And the answer is a little bit more complicated, of course, not a trick question, but the answer, it is false. Drug use is only about 1% lower among the total population than it was in the 1980s, after it reached a peak in the early 2000s. So we've kind of seen a peak, and then it's come back down about to where it was in the 80s. Number two, Latin America has a higher rate of cocaine use than the United States. About 95% thought that was false, and 95% of you are correct. Cocaine use in the United States is actually 3 times higher than in Latin America overall. And we're talking pretty small numbers, but about just over 2% in the United States, and a little bit, about 0.65% in Latin America overall again. So there's places that have higher and lower use within Latin America, but overall it's lower. And that seems to be a somewhat common misconception, is that there's a lot of local use of product in Latin America, and the fact is most people can't afford it, and those that do use it, they probably use it because that's how they're paid. If they're somehow involved in security services or other protection for drug traffickers, oftentimes they're paid in product versus in money, and that's how they become addicted. Number 3, the overall drug control budget has decreased in the past 2 decades, given shifting focus from the war on drugs to terrorism. About 70% thought that was true, and about 30% false. So that is actually, it is false. There's nearly a four-fold increase in the drug control budget from 10.8 billion in the early 2000s to over 40 billion in 2022. And so it depends. Now we can get into the details of what are we including in that, and we'll talk a little bit more about that further on. So don't get worried. But there are different ways to count what is the drug control budget, obviously, and we'll see. We'll talk about that more. So next slide, please. So very quickly, I found these images pretty informative in terms of where are we at with controlling drugs in the United States, and what are people using. You can see on the left-hand side, the huge reduction in cocaine after the 1980s, and the rise of opioid pain relievers after, in 1990s, the 2000s, and up till today. And then the rest are a little bit more stable, but still there. And so one of the things that strikes me about this is that is certainly the amount of opioids, which we see a lot and we hear about a lot in the news, and the different pushes to try to against their rise in the United States. And here we're talking both about fentanyl and the prescription use of painkillers, pain relievers. And so to me, it raises the question of, are we talking about an internal threat as well when we talk about drug control policy? Obviously our focus today is on Latin America, but it's something that we should really think about, and money is being invested in that. And I think that's appropriate. One of the things that I saw too is actually on the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, 3 of 4 people who used prescription pain relievers obtained them from a friend or relative for free. They weren't buying them on the street. They weren't getting them from Mexico. They were getting them from somebody they knew. Another 3 or 4, that was about half of the people did that, and then another quarter, so 2 in 4 obtained them that way, and another 1 in 4 obtained them from a single doctor. A single doctor was giving them to them. So I think that to me shows that it is 75% of that spike is from domestic sources. And again, I think we can see here that the cocaine's sort of decline, and then it's been on a steady state. And I think, that is something to be said for, has there been some amount of success there, or what would it take to get it further down? And that's open to debate as well. And so we'll move on from that. Next slide, please. Now, this is a sort of popular map. Maybe people have seen this before. And I think it's instructive just to see how complex of a web there is when it comes to the drugs that are moving from outside of the United States into the United States. Certainly a large number of those arrows coming from the Andean region of South America through Central America or the Caribbean to the United States. But when we talk about particularly fentanyl and other issues coming from that Golden Triangle region in Southeast Asia, that is now, when looking at the statistics, now the leading cause of death among drug users coming from fentanyl. Some of it comes directly to the United States, some goes through Canada, some goes through Mexico. So it is a cause for concern. But a large proportion obviously still comes from Latin America and through Central America and the Caribbean. Next slide, please. And I think the instructive piece of this slide is just to see that, they could have I've seen maps with 10 times as many lines. There are so many different routes and directions that can go both by sea, by air, and by land, that it's very difficult to know where they're going to come. And it demonstrates the balloon effect too. This is one thing that we saw a lot in Central America. As there was progress in Central America 10, 15 years ago, we started to see more shifting eastward into the Caribbean and through the Caribbean. And so that's something that's always going to be with us is if you can't stop at all, you might not stop any of it. And I don't know if we can set the video on that right-hand side. This is just I thought this was an interesting and instructive diagram if it works. And that's okay if it doesn't. But it shows how it's a moving target. It shows the flight path of drug planes over the course of, I think it was just a month. And you can see all the different landing spots throughout Latin America that they had. It was a simulation. And it just showed how easily the transit shifts within even a month's time. So assuming you had a strong response in a country, in a region, it might not be enough because it can always shift and it will continue to move. The other thing to notice here is the green areas in Honduras, where it indicates that there's a small amount of coca that is grown in Honduras now, which is a new challenge, right? That it's not just coming from the Andes. It never has just come from the Andes, but that there are regions even closer to home where that production is happening and can take place. So next slide. I think we can go back one more. Yeah. So this is where I wanted to just get back into a little bit specifically the impact on Honduras and on Central America, but using the case of Honduras, because I think this is probably the most illustrative, and I think we're probably going to see soon Guatemala following suit and seeing some of the same issues arise from Guatemala if they're not there already and they just haven't been uncovered. Maybe less so in a place like El Salvador that doesn't have as much of a footprint. It's easy for people to go around El Salvador because it's a small country. Same can be said for Belize. It has a little bit stronger connection to the Caribbean and the UK in terms of its support. But I think this is an instructive case because it tells us what can happen, and it happened at all levels. And it's just a place, I think, where Honduras, where drug trafficking has infiltrated pretty much everything in the political realm, and it's really become the norm. Mayors have run trafficking rings, high-level officials have siphoned off public funds. Drug money has infiltrated pretty much every level of government, and that comes at a time when at least 120 tons of cocaine passed through Honduras in 2019, according to the State Department. And just to put that into perspective, that's nearly 6 times the overall amount in 1986. The overall amount trafficked to the United States in 1986 at the height of the drug wars. So we're still talking about a large amount coming through Honduras. So there's a lot of profit to be made, a lot of power to be struggled over. And in Honduras, looking at the history of the presence of drug clans in Honduras, they started out as local clans controlling local territories, especially in the eastern part of Honduras, where there's less development and open expanses. But now smuggling is no longer controlled by Honduras's major drug clans. It's the Mexican cartels that have come in, and they did that by allying themselves with the National Party, the political party who ruled in Honduras from 2009 until just last month, when a new president was sworn in from a different party. And the crime and violence is often perpetrated or ignored by politicians in Honduras because they're involved in other activities, and they use it to either play to play to favor them or to depress the willingness to invest by others in paying attention to what's happening. So the case in this town, this is the city hall for El Paraíso, which is on the border near Guatemala. So it's a smaller town, it's about 20,000 people. And the mayor there, Alexander Ardon, became a narco trafficker, and then became mayor of, worked in the fields as a cattle wrestler, allied himself and had ties with one of the local clans, then became useful to the cartels. The cartels thought he would be even more useful to them as a mayor. And he really ruled this area of Honduras for the cartel until about 2 years ago, he was I guess he found his way into the sights of US authorities, and they were able to track him down, and he surrendered to them. He then became a state's witness and confessed to multiple murders himself, as well as organizing other murders, torture, and trafficking as much as 250 tons of cocaine into the United States. And the biggest part of that was he did this with the help of senior officials from the ruling National Party. And by consolidating land and power, he turned that little part of Honduras and set an example for other mayors like him in other places into a cocaine corridor for his different partners through the Mexican cartels. And overall, through good reporting by groups like Insight Crime out of American University and our partners in the region, they found where Honduras shows the highest levels of criminal infiltration of political institutions of any Central American nation. But they've done this at the same time as they're an ally of the United States in the war on drugs. They have been an ally, it depends. Certainly a couple of years ago, they were more of an ally than they are now. Next slide, please. But I think the important thing here too is, yes, the local level is just as important, and we'll get back to that too, about how important it is for individuals who want to see their government protecting them when in their decision, if they're trying to make the decision to stay or leave their country, for example, or move to a safer part of their country. But it doesn't stop at the local level. Through his testimony under oath here in the United States, Ardon named the former president, Juan Hernandez, as a co-conspirator. And just 2 days ago on Tuesday, Hernandez was arrested to face extradition proceedings in Tegucigalpa. And I think his first court hearing was yesterday. And the judge will determine whether or not he'll be extradited to the United States, which is not guaranteed because he helped install the Supreme Court, which one group of the Supreme Court will determine ultimately whether or not he's extradited, and he helped install those, which just shows how pervasive that influence is. So that's the overview of how involved this can get and how systematic and pervasive this kind of corruption can be from narco trafficking. Next slide, please. And what we wanted to find out was, what does this corruption and lack of reliable government mean for the average citizen in Honduras? So together with our partners in the Central America Research Alliance, we conducted a national poll in Honduras last year. And the year before that, we evaluated a national workforce development program for youth. And we used that opportunity to explore various issues. And one among them is what we're looking at here. And this in particular of if people see a good future for themselves and their families in Honduras, and we'll unpack that a little bit. And this idea of seeing a good future, really 6 in 10 Hondurans don't see a good future given the current state of affairs in their country. And that really is impacted by two major things: whether or not they feel safe, and whether or not they have confidence in the justice system. So I think that kind of lends importance to what we'll see here with Hernandez's extradition. Is there enough established rule of law for people to, and will the justice system do justice in the eyes of average Hondurans? And that will impact their interest in their ability to see a good future for themselves. And ultimately, because seeing a good future is the most reliable indicator of future migration intentions, it will help determine whether or not people want to migrate or not to the United States and elsewhere, mostly to the United States. And I think this is important, to really to reflect on, right? Is how A leads to B leads to C, and it's not a straight line. There's not a direct relationship. With our data, we can't prove that there's a direct relationship, but it does come into play when you see that over 40% of people take politics into account and what's happening at the political levels when they decide to migrate or not. It's also important, whether or not people migrate, that nearly 2 in 3 Hondurans don't see or have hope in their future in their country. That in itself should give us pause and make us think about what all is happening and what the role of the drug trade is in all of this, and our work to support institutions. Next slide. The other thing that I think was interesting that I wanted to share is that obviously the presence of gangs and drug traffickers impact people's sense of security and therefore seeing a good future and migration intentions. But one of the surprising things we saw was it's not always negative. The presence of these actors is not always seen as a completely negative thing to individuals. And that's something to take into consideration, is that oftentimes, especially in places where there's a strong gang presence, or to some extent also, and a presence of drug traffickers, there's a certain order that is established by those actors in that area that is not established in other places by the state. And so these actors, gang members or drug traffickers, act as a pseudo state in those areas. And as long as you're not on the wrong side of what's happening there, you actually feel a little bit safer, or you actually hear from your neighbors and in discussion with neighbors about the good things that are happening because of those actors in your neighborhood. So that's just one thing to take into consideration. The other part of that is this link that that is made at times about the involvement of gangs in drug trafficking. And I won't say that it doesn't happen, but I will say that I haven't seen evidence that it's pervasive. And one of the things that we found with that is just the overlap in areas. When you look at the geography of where people report gang activity and where they report narco activity, there's only about a 12% overlap nationally. And so that's something to consider, is that they're not one and the same, and there's not a huge link that's been proven between the two. Next slide, please. Now, this we talked about in the poll, but the demand for drugs in Latin America overall is lower than the United States. And even in places like Honduras that see a lot of drug trafficking, there is a low use of drugs overall. I don't have the specific numbers of cocaine use, but when you look at 2.6% are reporting marijuana use in Honduras compared to US teen marijuana use, which averages around 15%. That's a pretty low level. And then when you look at youth involvement through criminal statistics and self-reported delinquency, there's a very low involvement of youth in what's happening there. These are higher level drug trafficking transit points. And that, as I mentioned before, the fact that when those youth are involved, they're often paid in product, and that's where you actually see some of the use the higher levels of use of cocaine and harder drugs like that. Next slide, please. So what do we do about all of this? And that's a question I'm not going to answer for you because that would be too convenient. But I do want to walk through a couple of things. First of all, this idea of looking at the cost-benefit analysis of all this. We talk about budgets, especially as moral and political documents in the policy world. It's because without funding behind priorities, there are no priorities. And we look at, since the Nixon administration, when they launched the war on drugs in 1971 and declared drug abuse to be public enemy number one, the United States has spent an estimated $1 trillion on drug prevention and enforcement. And you can add to that, as I mentioned before, you can throw everything but the kitchen sink in there. You can separate it out, and we'll look at some of that. But you can add the cost of treatment. You can add the cost of extra policing and the cost of crime, all those different things into that number to make it even bigger. But $1 trillion on drug prevention directly. And within that, there's about a $5 billion annually that goes to cocaine interdiction. And a lot of that, as we saw from the maps, is coming from Latin America. And the question there is, we spend $5 billion annually on cocaine interdiction without having much effect on the drug supply or its price over the past 30 years. We saw it go down in the 80s, but since then there hasn't been much change. And so there's arguments on both sides, right? There's no counterfactual of what would have happened if we didn't do that. Maybe the high spending keeps that number low. That could be. Or is that high spending no longer necessary? Are we at a point where we could invest that money differently in other initiatives? There's obviously a lot of bureaucratic forces against that, as I mentioned. There's people that make their living from interdicting drugs and working on all this, and that makes sense. But we need to take a step back at times and decide: are we going to do a zero-sum budget and start over and really rethink this or not? That's open for debate. And I'd love to hear your perspectives on that. Next slide. So, and this is what I was talking about, the breakdown a little bit. So you can see the proportion of expenses over time for things like treatment, interdiction, international. And we can see the thing that really, and you can see it over time, the treatment versus the interdiction, in the drug control, the prevention versus treatment, I'm sorry. But up above, I think is really interesting, worth taking a look at, where if you add up the percentages, about 90% of the funding is spent on dealing with symptoms, and only 10%, the international portion and the prevention, work on the cause or the source of the problem. And so I think that's something to reflect on, is that a good balance? Could it be balanced in other ways? What if we spent more on prevention, or what if we spent more on supporting partners in Latin America at the scale of Plan Colombia, on working through institutional strengthening so that and protection and transparency, so that cases can wake their way through the courts, so that prosecutors are protected as they look at this locally. Is there a better return on investment on that? Is it more sustainable? Again, these are questions I put out there for our debate. Next slide. And I just want to put this in perspective too, that where are we at when I talk about this idea of, and I obviously, as I mentioned, I have a little bit of a bias because of the work that I've been doing and the work I've been looking at in how do we support structures outside of the United States to help deal with these issues. And so when we think about that, the large number that was on a couple of slides ago, $35 billion a year we spend on drug control recently. And we think about the total development assistance that we give to Central America, and this is under the new plan, Biden's new plan, which increased the amount, is $1 billion a year. which is in itself is less than 2% of the total foreign requests for the State Department and the Agency for International Development. And that foreign aid, so that 2%, is less than 1% of the overall federal budget. So when we're talking about development assistance that could potentially have better return on investment, that could potentially be more sustainable, we're actually talking about less than 0.1% of the US federal budget that could be used in the region to decrease other expenses to bring down that $35 billion number for treatment and prevention in the coming years. And potentially could be sustainable if we're able to establish transparency, if we're able to establish rule of law, those dividends will pay themselves back over time. I think with a whole webinar could be spent on looking at Plan Colombia and the successes and the challenges that came from it. But one of the largest successes is the peace treaty that was signed a few years ago. Not perfect, not perfectly implemented, but it is something that has paid off in the long run. And is that something we need to consider in places like Central America and places like Mexico? Next slide, please. So this is, I think this is where we kind of come to a close, and I think it's a perfect amount of time for questions and discussions after this. But here's kind of where I wanted to put out just an overview of what policy decisions then are on the table. There's more than this. I'd love to hear what people think. But there's really, we work on sort of all these, the typical spectrum, right? From stopping production at the source. It's difficult when you look at something like spraying. What are the secondary effects of spraying in fields? Do we support militarization of local communities? What are the impacts of that? What do we do to provide alternatives to farmers? Is there anything that's as profitable and reliable as growing coca? That's a good question, I think. Then do we stop it in transit? If we go back to those maps and we think about what are all the different ways that drugs can reach the United States and the balloon effects, it's never going to stop. We're never going to be able to interdict all or even the majority of it. Can we work on reducing demand or regulate and reduce the profits? That's certainly a political minefield, but maybe there's a more proportional response that could be taken in that spectrum, and the move towards legalization or regulation. And those first two options are more law and order on the extreme. But I think those that did make it through the brief and were able to read that, and the data make clear that the war on drugs has not been won over the past 50 years. If you look even just at the impact of mandatory sentencing, we now have the highest rate of incarceration in the world, and the cost of imprisoning numerous people is high and has become an industry into itself, the private prisons that are run. So the other extreme, of course, is legalization. That might result in a higher cost, and therefore there's always going to be a certain amount of illicit product coming in. How do you legalize dangerous substances? All good questions. So I think the question for us is there a need for a middle ground? And that's probably the great decision to be made. But I would put on the table these new alternatives of, are there important relationships in Latin America? The State Department, US Agency for International Development have been working on capacity strengthening. Is there a better return on investment there instead of interdiction? That really benefits not only us and helps stop the drug trafficking, but also benefits local populations and their seeing a good future, their ability to see a good future where they live. And then, of course, the domestic focus. Do we need to, as I mentioned early on? Do we need more of a focus? And I think the Trump administration, the Biden administration have recognized this and have put their money where their mouth is when it comes to, let's really look at the opioids and the prescription medication and see if can we do something domestically on that? And maybe there's more to be invested there, more work to be done. So that's all I have to set the stage for our discussion. And I look forward to hearing your ideas, reactions, and questions.
Great, Tom. Excuse me. Thank you so much. That's fantastic. I'll gently ask guests here to please put questions in the Q&A section. I will be trying to read those as clearly as possible, and we can get them to Tom and then have our discussion continue. A couple of questions came up in the chat during the presentation. I can just give you both of these at once, and you can just think back and remind us. So when you showed those, that slide of use, was that per capita or gross? And where did alcohol fit into those numbers?
Yeah. Alcohol was not in there. I don't have the stats on alcohol use. They should be readily available. But I don't, yeah. And I guess in terms of alcohol, and maybe the question is more about alcohol use in Latin America, that's certainly pervasive, but and again, I don't have the exact numbers, but I can't imagine that it's that much different than it is in the United States. And we'll have to collectively Google that afterwards because I'm curious. But and then the numbers were they gross or per capita? I guess I don't understand the question because they were percentage of use.
So they weren't adjusted per 100,000. They were percentage of use among
overall. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, here's a question from Terry. I'm going to lean and look crazy here. I apologize. Do the federal governments in the LAC work to stop the drug trade or actually ignore it because the amount of commerce that is tied up with their economies? Hard to believe the governments couldn't identify growing areas and go in and take them out.
Yeah. It depends. I think there are governments in Latin America that certainly do work to stop the drug trade, that have been and continue to be good partners. To a certain extent, they, just like we have our, our domestic concerns, they also have to do the same cost benefit analysis and say, hey, this is not a scourge that's impacting our society in the same way in terms of drug use. And so do we want to allocate our resources to stopping it? Now, of course, there's a huge economy for it. Unfortunately, many politicians benefit from that. And so they're reluctant to stop it. Not all, certainly not all. And so I would say a large, it depends. In terms of identification, yes, I mean, they know a lot of where these places are. But when you look at the remoteness of it and the resources available, stopping it just isn't, and again, doing that calculus of what are they going to spend their time and effort on, maybe isn't top priority. Plus they have other pressures from those actors. So for them too, it's the benefit of what's the reaction, or it's the analysis of what's the reaction when if they were to go in and try to spray on their own or do other things. So I think it's, there's just like there's a spectrum of response, there's a spectrum of cooperation, and then there's the case of Honduras points out, there's cooperation where you're shaking hands, but you're also, the president is shaking hands saying, yes, we'll work on this, but then is also, receiving funds from the cartel for his political campaign. So it's complicated. And I think as long as that funding and the money is there, that's going to continue.
Do you have any more that you could tell us about how relationships between countries in LAC have been impacted by these drug issues and policies?
Yeah. I think for the most part, the sad thing is right now, at least in Central America, is almost taking, lessons from each other about how to make it work in their favor at times. And I think that's what we see right now in Guatemala and El Salvador is the hollowing out of institutions to make way for corruption of various kinds, but including transnational crime and narcotics trafficking. And I think that's probably the reality more than any kind of decision to work together on these issues. It's more about taking lessons from each other on how to profit from it at times. And it's, again, it is not, it's not something that every administration in every country faces, but you'd be hard pressed to find, at least in Central America. And this, when I talk about Central America, I do mean the whole area, but particularly the countries of Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. And certainly in Costa Rica, Panama, and maybe Belize, this is less of an issue, but definitely taking pages out of each other's playbook when it comes to how to profit from all this.
Right, excellent. And then Linda adds another layer to this exact line here. Won't this need an international agreement to begin to have some impact on the trade, like United Nations agreements or a Latin American Union agreement, et cetera?
Yeah, so a big question or big discussion, especially in Central America, when you're talking about smaller economies, smaller countries, is what would be the benefit? Would there be a benefit in having a stronger union? They do have a sort of trade. There's a trade pact with the region. There's CICA, which is the Central America Integration, mostly a customs union. There is a lot of talk now, a lot of discussion over the past decade, starting in maybe 2008. There was an anti-corruption commission established together with the UN in Guatemala. A similar one was established later in Honduras with the Organization of American States, and then an incipient one in El Salvador before the last administration took over and quickly closed it. All three are now closed. And so the question is, could something like that be established at a regional level that would actually have some more teeth and some more impact and not be exposed to national politics to the extent that those were? And I think that's a possibility. I don't know. I think now sort of the surprising shining light is Honduras with the new administration, and they obviously have only been in power for less than a month. They have a lot to prove, but they're saying the right things, and maybe there is a corner to be turned with that would help sort of this regional cooperation move forward.
Great, thank you. Richard adds here, your presentation never mentioned the security forces, and the slide on linkages to the Honduran president had no active duty linkages, just retired head of FUSEP. What role do they play? Also the role of the judicial system and the prisons, both in combating and in protecting trafficking.
Yeah. The security forces obviously play a big role, but they play a role and they serve at the pleasure of the politicians. I think that's one of the big, in 2017, when the election was disputed in Honduras, that was the big question, is would the police and the military come out in favor and support of the presumptive winner or the incumbent? And they chose the incumbent. And I think that's, they're certainly there. In Colombia, they've been a big actor, the security forces, DAS as well, as, modeled after the FBI, professionalized service, not dedicated just to drugs, but certainly is a big part of their work. So I think there's obviously a role to play, but they're able to come into service based on the role of based on the request of the executive. And I think there is a concern, especially in places like Guatemala and El Salvador, where part of the peace treaties were to keep the military in their barracks. We've seen in response to gang violence where they've been, and in Mexico too, with but for drug trafficking, where the military has been called upon to work on and do street patrols. That is a very slippery slope for those of us who watch human rights closely. They're monitored the same way, but they're not trained in the same way as police. And so there's some major concerns there. I think the second part of the question, the judicial system, I think that to me is where there's been progress and failures. Obviously, I think if you look at Colombia, they have a very professionalized judicial system now. 20 years on after the start of Plan Colombia, it takes a generation. You have to get the new generation of young lawyers, prosecutors, and judges trained and installed, compensated, all of that for there to be the ability to really have a sustained change. And it's very tenuous. I think we've seen that especially in El Salvador. Well, currently, even just this week in Guatemala, the sacking of various prosecutors who are starting to pull threads on, what links of the executive to trafficking. In El Salvador, it's the same. The attorney general was named outside of the due process that is established in the Constitution. The previous one was sacked outside of due process. Members of the Supreme Court have been replaced without due process. And so that becomes there is no check and balance at that point. And that's where the concern comes. And it happens, unfortunately, it's quicker to undo than it is to establish the rule of law. The rule of law is quicker to undo than it is established.
Great, thank you. David says the alcohol was once illegal in the United States, but was legalized and the criminal element involved disappeared. We're currently in the process of legalizing cannabis, marijuana, et cetera, and legal sources are coming in line quickly. Can these examples possibly be translated into coca and related products?
Yes, I mean, they can be. The question is, do we want to? And what is the result of that? There's an interesting case right now in Oregon where they're testing that and they're seeing how far that might go. I think it would be an interesting thing to explore fully is, what would, and I'm not saying we should just try it. I think we should, scenario plan for what this might look like is, can you, by having a legalized and regulated trade of narcotics, can you take the money out of it so that it is not impacting those outside of the trade as much? And that might be a self-serving thing, looking at my focus on its impacts on democracy and human rights in Central America. But I think it's something that, after 50 years, why not ask ourselves that question? And why not kind of see it through and see what might happen. So
I'm always amazed because that question is really a public health one, and it falls so much into this political sphere and out of the public health space. And we know if we track those data over the last 50 years, when perception of harm goes up, drug use goes down. And the straight line all across those years has been availability. That's the interdiction failure. So you treat this as a public health issue, much like we did with cigarette smoking. Perception of harm up, use goes down. And even just to have that discussion in certain spaces is inflammatory now.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So then John says, did the legalization of marijuana in many US states cause Latin American cartels to switch to fentanyl? And how has COVID impacted the cartel's work?
Yeah, on the last piece, the Economist did a great piece on that. And they show where it really didn't slow it down at all, COVID. I think in some ways, you know, to your point, like one public health crisis took the place of another. And so, you know, there was the eyes of the world were turned on something else. People were indoors more. I don't know. I don't have the numbers from the past year to see, you know, what was happening in terms of use and things like that. But certainly in terms, it was an opportunity to establish territory and to really continue to work in terms of the cartel's work. I think, and it was also a time when we saw a lot of, you know, again, in the Central America case, a lot of backsliding, democratic backsliding, and opportunities for further corruption when funds were allocated for COVID response. And so it continued to infiltrate the, you know, any kind of response mechanism was completely overwhelmed with COVID, and other nefarious activity could be taking place. Did the legalization? Yes and no. I mean, to a certain extent, the money is in there. I mean, you certainly still see the marijuana being brought over primarily just from Mexico. It doesn't make as much sense to fly it from other places just based on the costs. But and so, yeah, I mean, there has been diversification based on that, but I think it predates a lot of the legalization. I'd have to look a little bit closer at that, but I think you know, they're going to go and produce whatever has the highest rate of return. And for a while, that has not been marijuana.
Somebody asked too, spraying coca crops seems counterproductive and dangerous in the long run for the farmers that grow it. Can you speak to that and maybe about what can substitute crop for farmers if they're not growing coca?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we'll be learning for a while, just as we did with Agent Orange, right? That what the long-term health impacts are of this on the most vulnerable people. You know, people that they don't have a dog in this fight, and they're trying to sustain themselves, and so they're growing whatever they can or whatever they're made to grow by the local cartel, and nothing's going to be as profitable, and nothing's going to really keep them as safe as growing coca. And so if you do diversify, you know, you're putting yourself and your family at risk. And so it doesn't even matter at the end of the day what your return might be. But I mean, we've tried everything from, you know, small vegetable plots to soy to coffee. And I think it's all, it makes us feel good, but I don't think it does much else.
Great. And somebody also asked here the role of the conflict between the Mexican and Colombian cartels. How does that factor into this whole thing that we're talking about?
Yeah, well, I think any cartel conflict, the biggest issue in my view are the kind of secondary effects. How is it affecting the population where they're at? And I think if you follow the news, so in Cancun currently and in Quintana Roo in Mexico, you're seeing this right now of a shifting turf war. And, you know, it's making the news because it's Cancun, but this happens everywhere. And then the secondary effects on the population of who's getting wrapped up in it and what does that mean? And that I think is the biggest thing. There's never going to be one. I mean, there's going to be a dominant cartel, and no matter which kingpins or cartel bosses you take out, there's always going to be somebody to take their place. And so I think we need to look at how it impacts people in each of these areas more than what it means for the cartels themselves.
That's the really nice additive piece to your work, that as I was reading, that to not just look at the impact on drug users, but in the production and all the other pieces prior to the use itself, how these communities have been firmly impacted from top to bottom by this. And I thought that kind of social ecological approach was really nice to see kind of zeroed in on. And as a researcher, there's really some interesting connectivity between those kind of macro neighborhood or societal variables than the individual ones as well. And I think we sometimes erroneously parse those out and look at them separately instead of as an interactional framework.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I don't think you can lean too much on the social ecological framework, right? Of how do concentric circles of influence impact each individual? And then what are the relationships between that? How does your family impact you, but how does your community impact your family? And those are all questions that I think get lost in this a lot. And it's, there's a macro level focus for sure, but then we can't miss what's happening at the lower level too.
Right. The war on something is a term I've heard for 51 years. Americans are big on the war on drugs, the war on terrorism, the war on sugary snacks, or whatever it is. These wars on abstractions make for great political theater. They get people excited and kind of jazzed up. But in the end, do they really do anything but just waste money? And I think the interdiction piece might be something, it's never going to happen in terms of stopping the theme, but the war on whatever, that generates excitement, dollars, political capital. Are we ever going to get to the point where someone's not declaring war on some sort of abstract scenario? And how do we get to that point?
Yeah, I think it's kind of, it does play to maybe our post-war mentality, right? Of, if you want attention, which then gives you the budget to deal with something, you have to declare war on it. And it goes back to that, how much, there is no such thing as a rational actor, especially in policy debates. But how far are we straying from that? And how far are we willing to go with that? And yeah, and it's a nice, to some people it has a nice ring to it, right? Of this is how we're going to handle it. But I think again and again, we've seen where that hasn't, whether it's an actual war or it's a war that involves smaller battles, then I think we really risk overstating and overplaying our hand and not focusing on some of the work that can be done to limit and reduce the need for those wars on whatever.
So I really should declare war on my COVID weight, but I'm probably not ready to go there quite yet, right?
Yeah, not yet.
I'm going to delay that. That's my 2023 resolution.
Yeah.
A couple questions here. These are multiple parts here. We can take them as we see fit. Phil talked about lower drug use by Latin American youth in the stats. At what level could we say that's due to cultural expectations? And then the drug use issue is more of a familial or North American, using that term loosely, of course, North American issue.
Yeah. Yeah. And I have to say, I don't deal with drug use prevention. It's a little bit out of my wheelhouse, but I think, when it comes to the lower drug rates by Latin American youth, I think, anecdotally, I can say that for the most part, it comes down to what are you going to spend your money on? And if you don't have the money, to feed your family or to feed yourself, you're probably not going to have it available for drug use. Now, you also see, on the streets of San Salvador, Guatemala City, and others, people huffing and doing other things that they're not going to be counted in these figures. But there is a problem with that, certainly, and they're very low cost options to get a high, and people will find those wherever they're at, no matter where they are. And whether disposable wealth is a big factor, I honestly don't know. I don't know the answer to that.
Okay, great. And someone said your presentation shows you're very knowledgeable and you did a great job presenting this tough issue. So just some kudos.
It's all in the moderation, of course.
In spite of the moderation. The other question I had in a paper I dug up of yours, which is always the scary prequel to a question, I'm sure. But one you did with Monty a while ago, you talked about kind of solutions and this notion of citizen security. and some of the frameworks down there they've used to try to modify communities. And it was really heavy with engagement of community members and direct involvement with security policy analysis and really strong action steps and community involvement. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Sure, yeah. So a lot of this comes from out of sociology, from social disorganization, right? How much do the way your community looks, the way your community interacts together, the way people participate, how much does that impact things like security, things like economic development, you name it. And of course, each field kind of has their perspectives on things, and sociologists would love to run to this as a panacea for all social ills. And I think what we found is that it does have its place, but it goes back a little bit to what we were saying about, it has its place between the family and the larger society. And if you have failings and issues at home, your societal level response isn't going to have an impact on those. Or if you have individual trauma, then your family might be dealing with bigger issues than they can deal with. And so it's the idea, I think, in a lot of what our research has, we continue obviously to build on it, but what we're finding is the importance of working at each of those levels. And that's what we're doing currently with the Agency for International Development and the State Department, is in their programming, in this money that they're investing in the region, is saying, how can we improve upon, we have different models. We have these individual interventions we do, we have these family interventions we do, we have these society level or community and then society level interventions we do. And how do we package those best in a place-based model? How do you focus on specific geographies and do all of those at once? Because that's the only way you're really going to establish, citizen security and which is the perception of security, not just the actual experience of being victimized or seeing victimization. And I think that, a lot of that is impacted by then what are the larger structures in place? Is there the influence of narco trafficking? Is there the influence of other kinds of corruption? Certainly all have an impact on that.
And even here in the United States, that notion of changing space, altering space, creating safe spaces for youth, we've seen that in cities like Minneapolis. They had an extensive program to put in basketball courts and things of that sort, but then residents got concerned because the youth were actually using them, and it was bringing an unsavory element into those spaces that it was designed to bring kids. They weren't fighting, they were playing basketball. So eventually what happened in many of those parks, the basketball hoops came down, so then kids had nothing to do, and then delinquency skyrocketed and shot back up. So you create the space, heaven forbid people actually use it, but they're not the right people using it. So all of a sudden we have to shut the space down.
Right. Yeah.
This massive twist. In Minneapolis, not to call them out, but many cities domestically have done that same thing. Yeah.
I think we keep trying it. I'm yet to see an standalone infrastructure project that increased a sense of security. I think together with other interventions, sure, but yeah, there's no basketball court in the world that makes everybody feel good about it.
Okay, and then in terms of the allyship, this was an interesting piece that you brought up with the high corruption in some of these places, but then them coming on as allies. Can you speak to that, and does that impact the intel that we get, where the funds go? Do they get siphoned off? How do we get around that potential conflict of interest there to actually be functional in those sorts of settings? What do you think?
Yeah. I think it's, the interesting thing, at least in the case, and the one I was speaking to was Honduras and President Hernandez there. And I think it's interesting because at the time of his allyship with the United States, we had his brother on trial in the United States. And it was well known that he was involved in some way, shape, or form, and they were putting the pieces together to prove it. But that's on the justice side. Even within the United States, this is the justice system doing its work. But the executive branch then has this choice of, do you completely turn your back on this, elected leader, no matter what the circumstances were around his election, or do you engage him? And I think we saw a lot under, no matter the administration, that's a challenge. And I think you saw, though, until the elections of this last fall, a real pause on pretty much any direct relationship with that administration. Recently, also a pause in the relationship with El Salvador, and probably moving towards a pause with Guatemala, even though that was the only country Vice President Harris could safely go to, safely in the sense that without getting wrapped up in all these other issues, she at the time could go to, and now is taking a U-turn. And I think that it has a huge impact on what we can get done in those places. And I say that not trying to, that sounded very imperialistic, but what can be done in those places in cooperation largely depends on whether or not we have a good interlocutor there. And that you can see that throughout the course of time in Colombia. Now, I think we definitely draw a big red line at us influencing then who gets elected and things like that, because that has never gone well for us. But I think it does, and it's a question of timing, and it's a question of our intelligence gathering and our diplomacy. So it involves, unfortunately, it gets into that bureaucratic mess of who's in charge of what, and whose interests are going to win out at the end of the day.
Great. We're just about out of time. Two more quick questions, though. Are you optimistic about the role the State Department can play? We saw large numbers of folks fleeing from that branch during the last administration, and they have to rebuild ranks and cachet and capital around the globe. Are you optimistic, as one who interfaces with the State Department a great deal with your own work, that some movement can be had again?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's really, from friends and colleagues that were there and left, and friends and colleagues that were there and stayed, I think there's a morale that is being rebuilt. And unfortunately, though, that sucks the wind out of any progress that was happening before that. And it's going to take more than just these next 3 years to do that. And so until there's some kind of consistency, I think from whatever the policy differences were from Clinton to Bush to Obama, you saw a strong role for the State Department and the Agency for International Development under all three of those administrations. And unfortunately, when you put the brakes on something like that, it's a big bus. And so it might come to a quick stop, but getting it started again is very difficult, especially when you don't have ambassadors approved and things like that. So let alone the other ranks. So I do have hope. I don't think I think we'll be able to continue to do good work as the United States and through our representatives in these countries. But yeah, between those challenges and between, who our relationship is with, it's not an easy path. Right. Great. And our last question here, and we spoke to this a little bit, but the role of the international community, such as the UN, to help combat this impunity and corruption. Yeah, I mean, there's models for it. There's models that have worked. I mean, in the case of Guatemala, the reason the CICIG, the International Commission Against Impunity, was having great success. It took a number of years to get started. When I was with the American Bar Association, we worked very closely with them on transnational crime capacity strengthening. So maybe I'm a little bit biased, but I think their record speaks for itself. And the reason it was closed then was because it was having success and because it started to get close to members of the legislative and executive branch, and did at different times. And then now that's, reverberating through even the public ministries. So their public prosecutor's office for corruption is now, the former lead prosecutor is now in exile. And so those are those are things that models we need to look at, and how can we improve upon them, I guess would be my thing. And that one of the things that's being debated is, do you do this at a regional level so national politics don't play as much of a role? But how do you get politicians to sign on to something that they know that they will then be exposed to, or could potentially be exposed to down the road? That's the challenge. So certainly good models, certainly has worked in the past, and I think is definitely worth efforts to try to recreate.
Great. Well, thank you. This has been fantastic. I could probably sit in here and we could pepper you with more questions, but I'm sure there are other things you have to get to on a Thursday. So this was fantastic. Thank you, everybody, for participating. I just want to give you a heads up for the next Great Decisions event that's going to be on Russia with Dr. Ellen Carnahan on March 3rd from 12 to 1:30 p.m. And she is going to be looking at Russian politics, opposition to autocratic regimes, mass politics, and political change. And she's going to look at the current state of U.S.-Russia relations and provide some insights about the future of this relationship under the Biden administration. And finally, again, thank you. And just one more little plug. These quality programs can only happen because of the support of our membership. So please think about becoming a member of the World Affairs Council of St. Louis today. We can throw that link back in the chat. It's already there. And again, Tom, thank you so much for your time and the energy and efforts with this. It's fascinating. As a cross-cultural psychologist, I love to see these linkages with our work, and it's just been a pleasure to spend this time with you.
Thank you, Matt.
Take care, everybody. Good night. Safe travels.